Hey guys, tonight we dive headfirst into a world that's shiny on the surface, but seriously gritty underneath. Why it sucked to be a medieval knight. You probably imagine dashing heroes charging through battlefields in gleaming armor, slaying dragons, or at least rival knights, and winning the hearts of fair maidens. Well, newsflash, it's not quite like that. Instead, you trudge through mud sweat under heavy plates of iron, and face endless days packed with grueling training and thankless duty. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, feel free to post your location and local time down below. It's always fun to see where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up to a cold, damp chamber that smells vaguely of old wood and even older sweat. This is your home now, or at least where you crash when you're not in the training yard on the battlefield or stuck dealing with the endless mess of medieval politics. Being a knight is not just about jousts and sword fights, far from it. It's a lifestyle loaded with obligations, physical hardship, and a social role that demands constant proving of your worth. Most people remember knights as noble warriors draped in shining armor, but here's the catch. Medieval armor weighs anywhere from 40 to 60 pounds, sometimes even more when you factor in weapons, shields, and other gear. Imagine carrying a medium-sized dog strapped to you all day. Plus, that armor traps heat like a personal sauna, especially in the summer. You sweat buckets under that steel, and getting it on or off without help nearly impossible. Historians still argue whether knights ever truly enjoyed the romantic lifestyle Hollywood likes to portray. Some say the camaraderie and occasional glory made it worth it. Others highlight the constant fear and exhaustion that dominated their days. Your life is punctuated by drilling endlessly on horseback and foot, learning to wield a lance, sword, and mace with precision, all skills you must master or face shame and worse. And then there's the social side. You're not just a soldier. You're a noble with responsibilities to your lord, your family, and your vassals. That means attending court, managing lands, and navigating a web of alliances that can turn deadly with a single wrong word. It's less knight in shining armor and more full-time stress manager with a sword. Sure, the idea of a knight sounds exciting, but reality quickly sinks in. Your days blend into one long slog of training, politicking, and preparing for a battle that could kill you or leave you maimed for life. And don't get me started on the mud. Remember that thick, sticky mud? It's everywhere. On roads, in fields, and even in your armor crevices. Fighting in a mud-soaked battlefield isn't exactly the graceful dance you see in movies. It's more like flailing in a giant dirty soup. A quirky fact, some knights wore tiny bells on their armor or horses, not for style, but to alert others to their approach. Imagine trying to sneak up on an enemy while jingling like a Christmas tree. In truth, the life of a medieval knight is a complex tangle of duty, danger, and discomfort wrapped in layers of steel and social expectation. And that's just the start. The dawn cracks over your cold stone walls, and it's time to start another grueling day in the life of a medieval knight. The armor you struggled to sleep in is now your daily prison, and you know exactly how every strap and buckle digs into your skin. Remember, it's not just any armor. This steel is painstakingly forged to protect your life in combat, but is also a relentless torture device during every moment in between. You trudge out to the training yard, where the scent of sweat, leather, and dirt fills the air like a medieval cologne. Your muscles ache from yesterday's drills, but you've no choice but to push yourself harder. Training isn't just about learning to swing a sword. It's about conditioning your body to endure the brutal realities of war. You'll spend hours on horseback practicing jousts that can end in broken bones, or worse if you mess up. Horse riding itself isn't a leisurely trot. It's a constant battle to stay balanced while wearing 50 pounds of armor and wielding deadly weapons. Historians still argue whether medieval knights were as disciplined as the romantic tales suggest, or if many simply survived by sheer luck and brute strength. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. While some knights dedicated themselves to mastering the arts of war and strategy, others leaned heavily on their horses, their squires, or their reputation to get by. Speaking of squires, they were your lifeline and your unpaid labor force. These young apprentices did everything from polishing your armor to tending your horses, and sometimes even fought in your stead. But don't expect them to do all the heavy lifting. You're expected to show leadership both on the battlefield and off. If a squire messes up, it reflects badly on you, so micromanaging them was part of the daily stress. And what about your weapons? You don't just get handed a sword and told good luck. These weapons were finely crafted sometimes, ornately decorated, but mostly designed to kill efficiently. Maintaining them was a never-ending chore, sharpening blades, oiling joints, and repairing damage from previous battles. Rust was the enemy, and it was always lurking ready to ruin your precious gear. Then there's the social theater of knighthood. Yes, you've got a sword, but you also have to know how to dance, recite poetry, and understand the complex codes of chivalry that often contradict one another. One day you're expected to be a fierce warrior. The next, a courteous guest at the Lord's feast. Historians still debate how sincerely knights adhered to these chivalric ideals. Many probably paid lip service while secretly cutting deals and betraying allies under the table. Living quarters for knights were rarely luxurious. Unless you were of high, noble birth, your chamber might be little more than a drafty room with a straw mattress and a wooden stool. And forget about the gourmet meals you see in fantasy stories. The typical knight's diet was heavy on coarse bread, salted meat, and ale. Fancy dishes were reserved for special occasions or the very rich. Starvation and scurvy were real threats, especially during long campaigns or sieges. Also, the smell of a medieval knight was probably not something you'd want to bottle and sell. You sweat under all that armor, bathed rarely by modern standards, and your clothes rarely changed. Hygiene was more of a concept than a practice, so don't be surprised if you and your fellow knights smell like a stable. Here's a fun if slightly gross tidbit. Some knights used crocodile dung as a sunscreen ingredient. Yes, really. The idea was to protect their skin during long hours in the sun, although whether it actually worked or just made them smell worse is up for debate. Despite all this, being a knight did come with perks, respect, land, and the chance at glory. But glory often came with a high price, and that price was paid in sweat, blood, and mud. You wake with a start, muscles stiff from yesterday's training, and the ever-present ache that no ointment can fix. Your days revolve around one thing, preparing to fight and likely die for someone else's cause. Medieval warfare was a brutal game of survival, where glory was rare and pain was guaranteed. Before dawn, you're already out on the field practicing formations and swordplay with your fellow knights. The clashing of steel echoes like a relentless thunderstorm. Each strike is calculated, but every fight is unpredictable. There are no slow-motion battles here, only adrenaline-fueled chaos, where even the best could fall in an instant. Unlike modern soldiers, you don't have luxury gear or advanced medicine to patch you up. A simple wound could become infected and kill you days later. The horse you ride is more than a mount, it's an extension of yourself. But these massive animals need constant care, and feeding and riding them in full armor is exhausting. A knight without a horse is little more than an armed foot soldier, and losing your horse in battle often meant certain death. Yet the bond between knight and steed was a complicated one, sometimes loving, sometimes fraught with frustration. Historians still argue how much actual battlefield heroism knights demonstrated versus how much was mythologized by later storytellers. While some knights did display incredible bravery, many were just as vulnerable to fear, confusion, and panic as anyone else. Chivalric romance painted them as noble and fearless, but the reality was far messier. And the weapons, your sword, lance, and shield, are vital, but so is your helmet, which can weigh as much as a bowling ball. The clanging metal restricts your vision and hearing, making communication on the battlefield difficult. You've learned to rely on shouted commands and simple signals, but in the noise and dust of combat, orders often go unheard. This was part of why medieval battles could descend into disorganized melees, where survival was sometimes just dumb luck. Sieges were a whole different kind of nightmare. Instead of the adrenaline rush of open battle, you faced days or weeks, trapped behind walls surrounded by enemies. Hunger, disease, and despair were your real foes here. There's something horrifying about knowing your death could come not from a sword, but from starvation or infection. And those siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams were terrifying machines of destruction designed to break your walls and your spirit. And then there's the less glamorous side, the constant politics and feuds. You might be fighting alongside men who hate you or under a lord who's more interested in lining his pockets than winning the war. Alliances were fragile and betrayals were common. You had to keep your wits about you, not just for the enemy on the battlefield, but for the backstabbers off it. A quirky little aside, some knights would carry relics or charms into battle, believing they offered protection. Whether these worked or just boosted morale is still debated. But in a world where death was around every corner, clinging to any kind of hope was understandable. By the end of the day, your armor is battered, your body bruised, and your spirit worn. Yet you're expected to keep going, because the code of knighthood demands courage, loyalty, and endurance, whether you feel like it or not. The morning light filters through the narrow windows of your damp stone chamber. The smell of stale straw and old sweat clings to the air. You're a medieval knight, but let's be honest, glamorous this is not. Your daily existence is a cocktail of discomfort, dirt, and drudgery that no epic poem ever bothered to mention. You trudge through a day packed with endless chores that have nothing to do with sword fighting or glorious battles. Maintaining your armor alone is a massive hassle. Each plate needs careful cleaning to prevent rust, because rust could be your death sentence in battle when metal fails you. Imagine spending hours polishing steel in the bitter cold, your fingers numb just to make sure your armor doesn't betray you. Then there's your weapons. The sword is more than a tool, and it's practically a companion. But a heavy companion that needs sharpening, oiling, and checking for cracks. A dull or broken blade is useless in a fight, and repairing or replacing one costs more than you might think. The lance, too, is a delicate beast, prone to snapping on impact and hard to replace far from home. You also spend hours on horseback, which might sound fun until you realize how grueling it is to ride for miles in full armor. Your muscles ache and your skin chafes under the metal plates and leather straps. The saddle digs in, and the reins rub calluses onto your palms. Riding all day isn't a leisurely trot. It's a constant battle against fatigue and discomfort. And let's not forget the ever-present risk of falling off your horse, plummeting from that height in armor, could easily break bones, or worse. Between battles, you're often stuck in camp life, which is anything but romantic. Imagine thousands of men crammed into muddy fields, surrounded by the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste. Disease spreads quickly here, making illness just as deadly as the enemy's sword. Dysentery, typhus, and plague were frequent visitors to these camps. Your meals. If you're lucky, some salted meat and hard bread. Fresh food is a luxury rarely afforded. And don't expect any gourmet medieval recipes. Your diet is basically what you can scavenge or carry. There's a reason why knights often looked gaunt and worn despite their reputation for strength. Oddly, hygiene was a tricky subject. You might think knights bathed regularly, but the reality was more complicated. Baths were sometimes seen as risky, believed to open pores to disease. Plus, water wasn't always clean or accessible. So many knights went days or weeks without washing, relying on coarse linen and occasional scrubbing. Historians still argue whether knights really followed the chivalric code as strictly as popular culture suggests. The dirty reality of their daily lives often clashed with the lofty ideals of honor and courtly behavior. At night, you lie on a hard cot, the cold stone walls closing in. The dreams of glory fade quickly when faced with the unrelenting grind of nightly life. Yet somehow you keep going because retreat isn't an option, and the promise of honor, however distant, keeps you tethered. The clang of metal and shouted commands pull you out of your restless sleep at dawn. Today you'll march, and not toward some glorious battlefield. No. It's another grueling journey through rain, mud, and endless fields where your feet sink deeper with every step. Marching as a medieval knight sounds heroic, but it's more often an exercise in endurance that tests every ounce of your resolve. You strap on your armor, again every piece heavier than the last, and hoist your sword belt knowing full well that your shoulders will ache by midday. The weight isn't just physical. It's a reminder of the expectations burdening you. You are the muscle of your Lord's ambitions, a living weapon wielded not for your glory, but for someone else's. Traveling on foot is tough, but your horse often has it worse. Feeding and caring for your mount is a full-time job. Horses consume vast amounts of grain and water, resources scarce on campaign. If food runs low, your trusty steed may grow weak or even die, leaving you stranded and vulnerable. A dead horse isn't just a loss, it's a death sentence in hostile territory. When you're not trudging through mud or nursing a sore back, you're on the lookout for bandits and enemy scouts. Ambushes aren't just the stuff of stories, they're a real and constant threat. You learn to sleep lightly with your hand never far from your sword's hilt. But let's talk about the weather, because medieval knights had no Gore-Tex jackets or insulated boots. Rain soaks through your chainmail, making your armor heavier and your skin chafe painfully beneath. Winter means frostbite and numb fingers that struggle to grip reins or swords. Summer, well, heat exhaustion and dehydration are no joke when you're wearing a metal suit in the blazing sun. Here's a quirky tidbit: medieval knights sometimes wore padded garments called gambesons under their armor, which acted like a medieval version of a shock absorber, helping to protect against blunt force. But it also meant you sweat buckets, smelling less than heroic after hours of hard labor. Historians still argue whether knights on long campaigns had enough downtime to rest, or if they were pushed relentlessly, risking breakdowns and desertion. The reality likely varied, but the physical and mental toll was undeniable. You dream of rest, but the road calls again. Every step, every sore muscle is a reminder that being a knight is less about glory and more about surviving the endless grind. You wake to the harsh rattle of the morning horn, your limbs stiff and aching from the day before. No surprise there. Today it's not just marching or guarding the camp, it's practicing your combat skills again. The endless drills are meant to sharpen your reflexes and keep you ready. But mostly they feel like a never-ending chore, grinding you down little by little. You pull on your gauntlets and grip your sword, the familiar weight oddly comforting despite the growing blisters on your hands. Swordsmanship is your art, your craft, but it's also an exhausting dance, repeated over and over, often with little variety. Swing, parry, dodge, repeat. There's no flashy tournament waiting, no cheering crowd. Just the sweat and dirt of a muddy training yard. Archery practice happens alongside, and you admire those long bowmen from afar. Their weapons seem effortless compared to your heavy broadsword. You wonder if you'd trade your cumbersome armor for a lighter role if given the chance. Probably not, because despite all the misery, there's an undeniable sense of pride in being a knight, however grudging. Quirky fact, some knights reportedly slept in their armor to get used to the weight and to be ready at a moment's notice. Not exactly a recipe for sweet dreams, but hey, who needs comfort when duty calls? You also learn the importance of maintaining your gear. Chainmail links can break, and a cracked helmet is a death sentence on the battlefield. Cleaning and repairing armor takes precious time, but skipping it risks injury or worse. Historians still argue whether knightly combat training focused more on actual battlefield tactics or on theatrical ceremonial swordplay designed to impress nobles. The truth might lie somewhere in between, but it's clear you spent countless hours honing skills that were as useful in court as on the field. Your muscles scream, but you push through knowing the next battle might demand everything you've got, or take you from this world entirely. Your daily grind doesn't get any easier when it comes to the dreaded siege warfare. Imagine dragging heavy siege engines through mud and muck for miles on end, then setting them up under the watchful eyes of archers raining arrows down on you. You trudge alongside your comrades, hauling what feels like an entire tree strapped together with ropes, only to find it's barely enough to breach the castle walls. Sieges were long, brutal affairs that could last weeks or even months. Hunger, disease, and boredom gnawed at your spirit almost as much as enemy attacks. You get to know the faces of your fellow knights and soldiers intimately, not because you want to, but because there's nowhere else to go and nothing else to do except wait for orders or the next wave of arrows. A fringe tidbit for you, some knights reportedly catapulted dead animals or rotting corpses over castle walls as a form of medieval biological warfare. Charming, right? Not exactly a bring-your-pet-to-work day, more like brace for the smell and pray it's not your turn next. Of course, you're armored up like a medieval tank, but even your polished plate isn't impervious to the relentless wear and tear. You spend cold nights worrying about rust setting in or your visor jamming at a critical moment. These practical concerns are a constant shadow behind the glory you once imagined. Historians still argue whether siege tactics evolved primarily through trial and error, or were the result of deliberate engineering advances passed down by specialist craftsmen. Either way, your role in the chaos is a mix of brute force and desperate patience. Two things you're quickly learning are not the same as glamorous. Between the monotony and the madness, you cling to small victories, a crack in the wall here, a captured watchtower there. But deep down, you know the real battle is surviving this slow grind without losing your mind or your soul. You think you're finally getting a break from the battlefield, but nope, feudal politics drag you right back in. Being a knight isn't just about swinging swords. It's about navigating a web of loyalty, honor, and shady alliances. 1 minute, you're pledged to your lord with a solemn vow. The next, you're stuck in an argument over land rights or marriage arrangements that could decide your fate more than any duel ever will. The real kicker. You're expected to toe the line perfectly, while everyone else plays their own power games. Backstabbing isn't just a metaphor here, it's a legitimate career hazard. If you thought armor was your best protection, think again. A sharp tongue or a sudden betrayal could pierce deeper than any sword. Here's a quirky tidbit: some knights reportedly carried secret letters sewn into their helmets, or hidden in their boots, early versions of spy tech, if you will. But historians still argue whether these were widespread tactics or just rare acts of desperation. You spend more time at noisy feasts and political councils than on the training grounds. The food is rich, sure, but the stress of constant negotiations makes it hard to enjoy. And don't get me started on the endless ceremonial posturing. Every handshake and nod is loaded with meaning. Every smile could be a trap. Your reputation is a fragile thing, polished and tarnished by rumors, gossip, and the success of your liege. One wrong move, and you might find yourself on the receiving end of a trial by combat or worse, exile. So you learn quickly that sometimes silence and subtlety are deadlier than any blade. Navigating this tangled world of politics means your honor isn't always your own. It's a commodity traded like coin. And you, my friend, are just one piece on a grand chessboard, hoping not to get sacrificed too soon. Just when you think you've got the hang of medieval politics, enter the grim reality of medieval hygiene. Spoiler alert, it sucks. You trudge through mud, sweat, and the occasional suspicious smell that definitely isn't from the battlefield. Bathing regularly was not really a thing, actually. It was more like a luxury for the super rich or the religiously devoted. The typical knight might go weeks, sometimes months, without washing properly. Imagine wearing heavy chainmail and a thick woolen surcoat soaked with sweat and grime, then hopping on your horse. Yeah, not a recipe for freshness. Here's a fun, if slightly gross fact: some knights tried to mask their funk with fragrant herbs tucked into their armor or helmets, sort of like medieval air fresheners. Lavender and rosemary were favorites, though their effectiveness is debatable. Historians still argue whether the stigma around bathing was truly widespread, or if some medieval folks were actually cleaner than their reputation suggests. Your armor doesn't help either. It's heavy, hot, and traps heat and odors like a medieval sauna. And that sweat and dirt, it invites lice, fleas, and all sorts of unwelcome guests. You become a walking ecosystem of bugs, often scratching where you shouldn't, hoping no one notices. If you think that sounds bad, wait until you realize that medical care for knights was a horror show. Wounds were often treated with whatever herbs or poultices the local barber surgeon had on hand, sometimes including crocodile dung or other now questionable remedies. Infection was a constant threat, and many knights died not from the sword, but from simple wounds gone septic. Your body is constantly under attack from disease, infection, and exhaustion. Knights were expected to be paragons of strength and endurance. But the reality is, you're just a sweaty, bug-bitten, sometimes stinking mess trying to stay alive long enough to earn glory. You're still reeling from the hygiene horrors when the crushing weight of knighthood's daily routines kicks in. Forget long, lazy mornings. Your days start before dawn, often with a chilly wake-up call from your squire or some harsh, lordly command. Your schedule is packed with grueling physical training, sword drills, jousting, practice horse riding, and not to mention endless hours polishing your armor until it shines bright enough to blind an enemy. Or at least that's the idea. This training isn't just about building strength, it's about survival. The sword you swing in practice could be the one that saves your life or ends it. Historians still argue whether knights spent more time training or actually fighting, but one thing's clear: the physical demands were brutal. And they never really let up. Your muscles ache constantly. Bruises and cuts are everyday decorations, and the risk of catastrophic injury is ever present. And while you're out here acting like some medieval action hero, your diet isn't exactly fueling you like one. You're eating a lot of bread, salted meat, and whatever vegetables the cook could scrounge up, sometimes with a side of dubious ale to wash it all down. Fresh food, rarely. Protein and vitamins, forget it. No energy drinks, no protein, shakes just whatever you can stomach after a long day in heavy armor. The strange bit. Despite the grueling physical work and poor nutrition, knights were expected to maintain a certain appearance, clean-shaven hair, neatly trimmed, and somehow still noble. It's like trying to run a marathon in a tuxedo and not spill your drink. Oh, and the squires. They're like your unpaid interns, but with more dirt and less respect. Their job is to carry your gear, tend your horse, and learn the ropes while you boss them around and occasionally call them out for not polishing your boots properly. The social hierarchy never lets you forget who's in charge. Knights had to juggle the impossible warrior-athlete aristocrat, and sometimes even a part-time diplomat. And all while probably smelling worse than the common folk. Fun, right? You're finally starting to think maybe the battles are the worst part of being a medieval knight, but hold on, it turns out the politics behind the armor are just as brutal. Every lord, king, or ambitious noble you meet wants to use you as a pawn in their power games. Knights aren't just warriors. They're also political tools, bargaining chips in alliances and feuds that stretch across kingdoms. Loyalty is complicated. You're expected to be fiercely loyal to your lord, but sometimes you're stuck between conflicting allegiances. Maybe your family owes fealty to one ruler while your liege answers to another. This creates a web of obligations that could tie you up tighter than your chainmail. Breaking those oaths could get you branded a traitor or worse. There's also the whole matter of reputation. You have to cultivate your image carefully, be brave, but not reckless, chivalrous, but not naive. The pressure to live up to the ideals of knighthood honor, courage, generosity often clashes with the brutal realities of war and survival. Some historians still argue whether these ideals were ever truly practiced or mostly served as propaganda to keep knights in line. And speaking of propaganda, let's not forget the church. The church had massive influence over knights' lives. They were expected to attend Mass, regularly donate generously, and occasionally take part in religious wars like the Crusades. If you slipped up morally or religiously, you could find yourself excommunicated, essentially blacklisted from medieval society. Then there's the money game. Knights needed funds for armor, horses, and weapons. But their incomes often came from land grants that could be unreliable or contested. Managing estates was a full-time job on its own, and mismanaging could lead to poverty, which was an embarrassing fate for a knight. In short, being a knight meant juggling war, loyalty, reputation, religion, and finance, all while trying not to get skewered on the battlefield or outmaneuvered in court politics. You probably won't survive this balancing act without some serious scars, visible or otherwise. You think the day-to-day grind of knighthood couldn't get any worse? Surprise. Training doesn't end once you're dubbed. In fact, it intensifies, consuming your life with endless drills, horseback riding, and weapon practice that leave your muscles screaming for mercy. This isn't some weekend hobby. This is a 24/7 commitment to being a walking, sword-wielding machine. Imagine waking up every day knowing your job is to perfect the art of hurting people and getting hurt yourself, and there's no day off. The social aspect is equally exhausting. Knights had to be master networkers at medieval court, constantly attending feasts, tournaments, and councils, not to mention practicing the art of small talk with nobility, who could make or break your career. You need to smile at the right moments, hide your irritation when a rival insults your horse, and keep your ego in check when someone flaunts a newer, shinier suit of armor. It's basically the worst office politics ever. Speaking of tournaments, these events were supposed to be the highlight of the knightly calendar. But behind the pageantry tournaments were brutal, sometimes deadly affairs. Injuries were common, and death wasn't unheard of. Plus, tournaments were expensive to enter, horses' armor repairs, and the entry fees could bleed your purse dry. Some fringe historians debate whether these spectacles were more about entertainment or political posturing, but either way, they weren't the glamorous jousts romanticized in stories. You're also stuck with the constant grime and discomfort of medieval hygiene nights, rarely bathed and chainmail rusted, if not cared for properly. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Yeah, some nights might have been just as inventive with personal grooming. Or just stank up the castle halls. All this training and socializing also leaves little room for personal happiness. Marriage often served political alliances, not love. You might be married off to a stranger while still dreaming about freedom or a quiet life. Historians still argue whether knights felt trapped or genuinely embraced their rigid roles. In the end, being a knight was less about glory and more about grinding through a daily maze of physical, social, and psychological challenges. You might think you're living the dream, but the reality is a bit more medieval. Just when you think you've nailed the knight lifestyle, the brutal reality of battlefield injuries drags you back down. Remember, this is a time before antiseptics, antibiotics, or even proper anesthesia. Getting wounded in battle was like rolling the dice on whether you'd survive infections, gangrene, or a slow, agonizing death. Even a minor cut could turn fatal if dirt and bacteria settled in, which, spoiler alert, they often did. Surgeons were more barbers than doctors, and their tools, if they had any, were far from sterile. It's no wonder some knights prayed harder than they swung their swords. Amputations were common, and without effective painkillers, the procedure itself was a nightmare of agony. You might lose a limb, and then face the daunting challenge of living with it if you survived at all. Prosthetics were rudimentary at best. Think wooden sticks strapped awkwardly to your stump. Mobility and battle readiness took a huge hit, not to mention your chances of social status and income. Yet despite these dangers, knights were expected to return to battle as soon as possible. Weakness was frowned upon. Loyalty meant picking up your sword, bandaged or not. Some fringe historians argue that this glorification of battlefield suffering served as a form of psychological control, reinforcing the knight's role as a relentless warrior. On the flip side, the medical practices of the time were a curious mix of superstition and surprisingly practical remedies. Wound cleaning often involved wine or vinegar, and herbal poultices could sometimes stave off infection, though not reliably. Knights who survived might swear by charms or relics, believing divine intervention played a part in their recovery. Historians still debate how effective medieval medicine truly was, but there's no doubt that the mental toll of injury and recovery was immense. Add to this the constant threat of death from disease, poor camp conditions, and exhaustion. Being a knight wasn't just about facing swords. It was about surviving a deadly cocktail of battlefield trauma and the filthy realities of medieval warfare. You might imagine medieval knights as dashing figures, always clad in shining armor and honored at grand feasts. But the everyday reality, pretty grim and sometimes downright embarrassing. The social pressures alone could make you want to hang up your helmet. Being a knight meant constantly navigating a complicated web of obligations, from fealty to your lord to maintaining your reputation to mastering the fine art of politicking at court. Yes, knights were often diplomats and social climbers, not just muscle-bound warriors. You're expected to attend endless ceremonies, jousts and banquets where the wine flows freely. But so do the gossip and rivalries. A single social misstep, like losing a joust or making a tactless comment, could cost you prestige or even your lord's favor. And Lord help you if your armor gleamed less than the next guy's. That was basically medieval social media status, and you needed to keep up. Some fringe accounts say knights even had personal armor polishers, which sounds fancy until you realize that meant spending hours scrubbing metal rather than sharpening your sword or catching some sleep. Also, there's the constant pressure to marry well and produce heirs. In a world where lineage and alliances mattered, your personal life wasn't just yours, it was a political game. Yet the dating scene wasn't all roses and chivalric poetry. Arranged marriages and strategic betrothals meant you could find yourself wed to someone you barely knew, and romance was often an afterthought. Historians still argue how much genuine affection existed in these unions, but the political stakes were very real. And don't forget the nightly education hours of training in arms court etiquette languages, and even hunting. You had to be a warrior, a scholar, and a performer all at once. The mental and physical exhaustion was brutal. Plus, those sleepless nights spent on cold castle floors or drafty tents, far from the glamorous bedroom scenes in movies. In truth, the knight's life was a relentless balancing act between brutal warfare, high society, and personal survival. Not exactly the romantic saga you might have imagined. By the time you reach the twilight of your knighthood, you're likely exhausted, battered, and maybe a little disillusioned. The years of relentless training battles, political games, and social obligations have taken their toll. Your body aches under scars and arthritis. Your reputation is a delicate balance of victories and rumors, and you're probably longing for something softer than chainmail and cold stone walls. Retirement for a knight wasn't always an option unless you were lucky enough to become a lord or secure a church position. Many knights found themselves struggling to adapt to life without the constant adrenaline of war or the status of their youthful jousts. Some retreated into monasteries or estates, others faded into obscurity, their stories lost to history except for the occasional dusty scroll. Yet there was a certain melancholy dignity in that fading away, a bittersweet reminder that even the most honored warriors were human after all. You realized the life you fought for was as exhausting as it was exhilarating, full of hardships, sacrifices, and unexpected disappointments. The glitter of the knightly ideal couldn't fully mask the reality of cold nights, painful wounds, and endless duty. Historians still debate whether the chivalric code truly influenced knightly behavior or was mostly a poetic aspiration. But one thing is clear, being a medieval knight was far more complicated, demanding, and sometimes downright miserable than the fairy tales led on. You probably wouldn't have survived it long, but you can still appreciate the grit and stubborn hope it took to live that life at all. Now, as the fires die down and the last echoes of the battle fade, you can finally close your eyes. Let the armor slip away and rest. The stories of swords and honor might never be simple, but tonight at least they can soothe you into a gentle sleep. Hey guys, tonight we dive deep into a world of clashing swords, simmering rivalries, and a deadly duel that would echo through history. Picture yourself in late 14th century France. Dusty villages, looming castles, and knights clad in heavy armor, trudging through muddy fields. The air is thick with tension, not just from impending war, but from personal grudges that could mean the difference between life and death. You probably won't survive this if you find yourself on the wrong side of honor back then. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, where are you watching from? Drop your location and local time in the comments so we can get a global vibe going. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1386, and France is a patchwork of unrest and fragile alliances. The 100 Years' War has been raging for decades, and the political landscape is as unstable as ever. Lords and knights jockey for power, while peasants bear the brunt of endless conflict. Life here is no fairy tale. It's brutal, unpredictable, and often unfair. Jean de Carouge, a man of humble beginnings, has clawed his way into knighthood by sheer grit and skill. Unlike some knights born into privilege, Jean's path is carved from struggle, his armor heavy not just from metal, but from the weight of expectations and the scars of battle. His rival Jacques Legris is a court favorite known for charm and cunning rather than courage on the battlefield. Their simmering animosity is more than personal, it's political and social, entangled with matters of land honor and influence. This story is about more than just one duel. It's about the harsh realities of medieval justice, the roles of men and women, and a society that could settle accusations with a fight to the death. Historians still argue whether Jean's victory truly served justice or simply reinforced a brutal status quo. You're about to see what it really meant to be a knight, when honor and survival were one and the same. You trudge alongside Jean de Carouge. As the sun beats down on the uneven dirt roads of Normandy, your heavy boots sinking slightly into the muddied earth. The smell of sweat and leather mingles with the faint scent of wood smoke from nearby villages. You're not just carrying the weight of your armor, but the burden of a name, one that must be defended at all costs. Jean's story begins not with glory, but with hardship, as he wrestles to maintain his family's honor and holdings in a world where power is everything. Jean's early years are typical for a would-be knight, years of training, sparring, and learning the brutal art of war. But unlike the pampered sons of nobles, Jean's rise is marked by relentless effort and occasional setbacks. He fights in skirmishes, earns scars, and makes dangerous enemies none more threatening than Jacques Legris, a charismatic courtier who seems to glide effortlessly through court politics, while Jean fights with grit on the front lines. Legris is everything Jean isn't smooth-talking, favored by the Count, and known for his silver tongue rather than his sword arm. Yet beneath that charm lies a ruthless ambition that threatens Jean's precarious position. The rivalry between the two men isn't just about personal slights. It's a struggle for power, reputation, and control over valuable lands. You notice how medieval knighthood wasn't the romantic ideal you might expect. Armor scratched and dented, horses skittish, and even the best warriors could fall to illness, injury, or betrayal. Knights like Jean lived with constant danger, not just from enemies on the battlefield, but from lawsuits, political schemes, and social rivalries that could ruin a man overnight. Here's a quirky tidbit: medieval knights sometimes used bizarre methods to keep their helmets from fogging up, including breathing through metal tubes or tying wet cloths around their heads. It's a small glimpse into the daily discomforts behind the shining armor. Historians still argue whether Jean's eventual challenge to Legris was driven purely by justice or fueled by personal vengeance and desperation. What is certain is that the feud set the stage for one of the most dramatic trials and duels of the medieval era. You're walking with Jean, now feeling the sharp sting of uncertainty in every step, knowing that the path ahead leads to a deadly confrontation that would define not only their lives, but the justice system of the time. You stand in the chilly, drafty great hall of the castle, the stone walls echoing the murmurs of nobles and knights alike. Jean de Carouge's reputation hangs in the balance as whispers swirl about a terrible accusation. His wife, Marguerite, claims she has been violated by none other than Jacques Legris. The room is heavy with tension, a mix of disbelief, scandal, and simmering hostility. This isn't just a personal matter. It's a public spectacle with the highest stakes. In medieval society, a woman's word alone rarely held much power without a man's backing. Marguerite's courage in stepping forward is extraordinary, especially given the brutal consequences that could come from accusing a man of Legris's status. You feel her fear and determination as she stands against a man protected by friends' favors and the complex web of feudal loyalties. Jean is faced with a grim choice: accept the court's often biased judgment or demand trial by combat, a brutal medieval version of let God decide. This trial by combat wasn't just theater. It was a deadly test where the knight's life was on the line. Victory meant vindication. Defeat meant death or disgrace. The entire kingdom watches, hungry for justice, or at least spectacle. You can almost hear the clang of swords in your mind, feel the scrape of metal on metal, and the pounding of hooves as two men prepare to fight, not only for honor, but for the truth itself. Trial by combat was both revered and feared, a stark reminder that medieval justice often relied on brute force rather than evidence. Here's a quirky fact: sometimes combatants would prepare by fasting, praying, or even consulting astrologers, because the outcome was believed to be divinely guided. Imagine entering a duel not just against a man, but against fate itself. Historians still argue whether trial by combat truly delivered justice, or was simply a brutal game for the powerful to settle scores while the common people watched. Either way, it was a grim reality for knights like Jean, caught between law and violence. As you watch the courtroom drama unfold, you realize this duel is about more than honor. It's about survival in a world where your fate could be decided by a single strike. The morning of the duel dawns cold and gray, with a mist hanging low over the field where Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris will face off. You trudge through the muddy ground, the weight of your armor pinning you down like a lead blanket. Every step feels like a battle before the real one even begins. This isn't some glorious fight under a bright sun. It's a grim necessity, a deadly performance with your life hanging in the balance. Jean's armor is heavy, clunky, and uncomfortable, a far cry from the sleek images of knights you might have seen in movies. The metal presses painfully against bruised skin, and the helmet's narrow eye slits limit your vision to a tiny slice of the world. You're hot, sweaty, and every breath feels trapped. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from a previous story? Well, knights often dealt with skin irritation and infections beneath all that metal, too. Comfort was clearly an afterthought. As the crowd gathers, you notice the nervous energy buzzing through the air. Nobles, peasants, and clergy alike are here, turning this into a rare, gruesome form of medieval reality TV. The duel is both a trial and a public spectacle, blending justice with entertainment in a way that feels unsettlingly modern. The church officially sanctioned these fights as a form of divine judgment. But it's hard not to wonder if some just enjoyed the drama. The first clash of swords is thunderous, the sound echoing like a clap of doom across the field. Sparks fly, and sweat mixes with blood as the combatants circle each other, each strike a test of skill, strength, and endurance. This is not a quick skirmish, but a brutal, exhausting ordeal that could last hours. You feel every ache, every muscle scream, and the sharp sting of cuts and bruises. Here's a quirky tidbit: some knights carried lucky charms or religious tokens tucked into their armor, hoping to tip fate in their favor. Others had personal heraldry painted on their shields, but in this fight, personal honor and raw survival instincts matter most. Historians still argue whether these duels truly reflected fairness or simply reinforced the power dynamics of medieval society, where the wealthy and well-trained had the upper hand. Either way, for Jean and Jacques, it was a fight for their very lives, with Marguerite's honor hanging in the balance. The duel isn't just a contest of weapons, it's a crucible that tests everything Jean stands for. And you can't help but feel the weight of history pressing down as the battle rages on. The duel drags on each strike, and parry a brutal reminder that this is no game. Your muscles scream in protest beneath the armor, and the air feels thick with tension and dust kicked up from the churned earth. Jean's breath comes heavy misting in the cold air, his heart pounding like a war drum beneath the plate. It's not just about strength. It's endurance, willpower, and sheer stubbornness to keep going when every instinct screams to stop. At one point, Jacques lands a solid blow, and you can almost feel the jarring impact through Jean's bones. This isn't a choreographed fight. There's real danger here, and one misstep could mean death or lifelong injury. The crowd's cheers and gasps swirl around you, a strange mix of excitement and horror. The medieval justice system may have looked to God to decide the winner, but down here in the mud, it's all blood, sweat, and grim determination. One interesting fact, the use of the judicial duel as a legal practice was actually a desperate last resort. Medieval courts were often slow and corrupt, so sometimes when no clear evidence was available, they turned to trial by combat. It was believed God would protect the innocent. But historians still argue whether this ever truly delivered justice or just prolonged suffering. You also notice how the knight's heavy armor designed to protect actually made the fight more complicated. It limited mobility, made dodging slower, and added exhausting weight. Some knights even had to rely on squires to help them don the armor, making the whole thing a cumbersome ordeal before the fight even began. A quirky tidbit, some knights practiced knight yoga, yes, medieval stretches and flexibility exercises to better move in their armor. Not exactly what you'd picture in a helmet and chainmail, but anything to avoid looking like a clumsy tank on the battlefield. As the duel nears its climax, Jean's determination shines through. The fight is as much mental as physical, and you can feel the raw tension between honor survival and the heavy stakes riding on every swing. The fight reaches a desperate crescendo. Every slash and thrust is fueled by more than just physical strength. It's raw emotion, the clash of pride, fear, and a desperate hope for survival. Jean's vision narrows as adrenaline floods his senses. Sounds around him dull to a muffled roar. You can almost taste the grit in the air, feel the sting of blood dripping down your face beneath that suffocating helmet. This isn't a noble dance, but a grim struggle for life itself. Armor dents and scratches tell the story of the fight, each mark a near miss or a blocked attack. Jean's joints ache under the unyielding weight, his arms trembling but still moving, still fighting. You remember that knights often suffered from heat exhaustion and dehydration during battles, trapped in their armor with nowhere to cool off. Despite all the pageantry and tales of glory, being a knight was physically punishing. A quirky historical note, some knights carried small flasks of vinegar or wine, both for cleaning wounds and as a mild painkiller. It's hard not to wonder how effective these were when compared to modern medicine, or how sour that vinegar must have tasted mid-duel. As the duel nears its end, the spectators lean forward, their breath held tight. The church's presence looms large, with clergy watching intently, ready to declare divine judgment. The outcome here isn't just personal, but a matter of public record and faith. Historians still argue whether the Church's endorsement of these brutal trials was a genuine belief in divine justice or a political tool to maintain order. Finally, with a decisive blow, Jean de Carouge lands a critical strike, forcing Jacques Legris to yield. The crowd erupts, some in relief, others in stunned silence. The duel has ended, but the ripples of this brutal contest would echo far beyond the muddy field. For Jean, victory meant much more than survival. It was a reclaiming of honor, a vindication of his wife's accusation, and a rare example of medieval justice in action. But as you trudge away from the scene, you can't help but feel the heavy cost paid by everyone involved in this deadly spectacle. After the duel, life doesn't suddenly get easier. You'd think that winning such a brutal public fight would mark the end of your troubles, but for Jean de Carouge, the aftermath is just as complicated. His reputation as a knight is both bolstered and burdened by the duel's outcome. Sure, he's legally cleared and socially vindicated, but the scars, both physical and emotional don't fade overnight. You feel the weight of the duel's shadow trailing behind John. Medieval society was obsessed with honor, and this fight was as much about defending family dignity as it was about justice. Yet despite his victory, Jean still faces political rivalries, shifting alliances, and the ever-present threat of vengeance. Knights weren't just warriors. They were players in a complicated game of medieval power, where loyalty was often a currency more fragile than chainmail. Interestingly, historians still argue whether duels like these truly restored honor or merely escalated cycles of violence and grudges. The court of public opinion was as fierce and unforgiving as the battlefield itself. And John's future depended on navigating this delicate social minefield. Here's a quirky fact. Jean's armor, believed to be battle-worn from the duel, became almost a relic, rumored to hold protective powers and displayed by his family for generations. It's a medieval version of souvenirs from that crazy trip, except much bloodier. And life after the duel also meant dealing with the practical realities, healing wounds, the aches of old injuries, and the constant reminder that being a knight wasn't all chivalrous banquets and courtly love. Most knights never retired peacefully. Many died young or fell into obscurity, forgotten by history. As you imagine Jean's journey beyond the field, you realize that the story isn't just about a duel. It's a window into the brutal, exhausting, and often thankless life of a medieval knight, where every victory comes at a steep price. Now, as you trudge through the years following the duel, you get a clearer sense of the daily grind behind the legendary armor. Being a medieval knight wasn't just about dramatic clashes or courtroom drama. It was about endless training, monotonous patrols, and sometimes the soul-crushing boredom of castle life. You wake up to the clang of smiths hammering armor, the smell of damp leather, and the taste of coarse bread washed down with lukewarm ale. Glamorous, not so much. Jean's story reminds you that knights often served lords and kings who could be as unpredictable as medieval weather. Loyalty wasn't just noble, it was survival. One moment you might be praised as a hero, or the next you could be sidelined because of court intrigue or a sudden shift in politics. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from earlier? Yara knights had to deal with weird, uncomfortable realities while trying to keep their image spotless. There's a lesser-known fact about Jean's life here. Knights sometimes doubled as diplomats or messengers, a far cry from the sword-swinging image you probably imagined. And historians still argue whether this civilian side of knighthood was actually more important than their battlefield prowess. You can almost hear the creak of Jean's worn saddle as he rides to fulfill these duties, his armor clinking quietly, contrasting sharply with the dramatic duels. Despite the dangerous reputation, much of his life was spent navigating courts, brokering alliances, and trying not to get poisoned by jealous rivals. This quieter, less heroic side was just as essential, yet far less glamorous. So while the duel was a fiery spectacle, it's this day-to-day life, the endless waiting, the political chess, and the grind that really shaped Jean's fate. Being a knight wasn't a steady march to glory. It was more like an exhausting, unpredictable slog through mud and rain, where the only certainty was that you'd probably be cold, hungry, and tired. You step deeper into Jean's world, where the battlefield isn't always a grand, sweeping vista, but a cramped, chaotic melee. It's not just about wielding a sword. It's about surviving the madness. Imagine the deafening roar of clashing metal, the acrid smell of sweat and blood mixing with the dust. Your visor fogs up, your gloves slip on the hilt, and every muscle screams from the strain of armor that's both your protection and your prison. John knew this all too well during skirmishes before his infamous duel. Battles were brutal, disorganized affairs, where discipline often dissolved into chaos. You might think knights were these invincible heroes, But many fell not from enemy swords, but from exhaustion, heat stroke, or infections from minor wounds. The idea of a glorious charge often clashes with the reality of a muddy, slippery field where footing was uncertain and the screams of the wounded echoed endlessly. Here's a quirky tidbit: some knights reportedly used crocodile dung as sunscreen or insect repellent. Yes, medieval self-care was inventive, but questionable. It's a reminder that knights weren't these polished warriors. They were just as vulnerable to the elements and diseases as any peasant. Historians still argue whether the romanticized chivalric code truly guided knights, or if it was mostly propaganda to mask their brutal realities. Jean's story blurs that line. He's a figure torn between the ideal and the harsh truth, caught in a world where honor could quickly turn into survival. So you trudge forward through this mess of sweat, mud, and steel, recognizing that every knight's tale is less about shining glory and more about gritty endurance. The battlefield was as much a test of stamina and luck as skill. And sometimes the luck, you find yourself pulled into the tense atmosphere of medieval justice, where the law often felt as brutal and arbitrary as the battles you've just imagined. Jean's life would come to hinge on one of the most dramatic and deadly legal practices of the time: the trial by combat. This wasn't just about winning or losing a fight. It was about fate, divine judgment, and survival under impossible odds. Imagine being accused of a terrible crime you may or may not have committed, and the only way to clear your name is by literally fighting for your life in front of the whole village. No lawyers, no appeals, just steel and muscle deciding your fate. Jean's duel was the last officially sanctioned judicial duel in France, marking the end of an era when violence was law's ultimate arbitrator. Here's a quirky fact: the duel had strict rules: no biting, no eye gouging, but these were often ignored in the heat of battle. Some knights reportedly hid small knives or even spiked gloves to gain an edge, turning the fight into a chaotic brawl despite the code. And despite the ritualized nature, it was far from a fair contest. The challenger often faced overwhelming pressure, and the stakes were life or death. Historians still debate whether trial by combat was a legitimate way to seek justice, or just a cruel spectacle favoring the strong and well-trained. Jean's duel encapsulates that debate perfectly. Was it justice or a fatal gamble dictated by brute force? You can almost hear the crowd's murmurs and feel the weight of expectation as Jean steps into the arena, every muscle taut, every breath shallow. This isn't just a fight. It's a showdown that will decide the course of lives and reputations, a brutal reminder that medieval justice was as unforgiving as the battlefield itself. The duel begins with a heavy silence falling over the crowd, broken only by the clang of steel as Jean de Carrouge and Jacques Legris face off. You feel the tension in the air, thick like the smoke from nearby torches. Every spectator holds their breath, knowing this combat will decide not just a man's fate, but also the honor of families and the trust in a legal system that feels equal parts mystical and merciless. Jean's armor feels cumbersome, weighing down his movements as much as the burden of what's at stake presses on his mind. You can almost taste the dust kicked up by their feet, smell the sweat mixing with the cold iron scent of weapons. Each strike and parry is a dangerous dance, one slip, one missed block, and it could all be over. Despite all the training and strength, Jean knows this is more than just a physical fight. It's a trial by fire where fate and skill collide. One unexpected tidbit about duels like this: some knights would whisper prayers or hold religious relics for luck, hoping divine intervention would tip the scales. Jean, a devout man, clutched a small charm blessed by a local priest, believing the gods might grant him justice. It's a reminder that medieval battles were never just physical. They were steeped in superstition and faith. Historians still argue whether such rituals genuinely affected outcomes or merely ease the anxiety of the combatants. But in this moment, as Jean lunges and parries, you can see how those beliefs gave warriors the courage to face death head-on. Remember how the legal system offered no second chances. This duel was at win, and Jean's name is cleared. Lose, and the verdict is death. The crowd's whispers crescendo into gasps and cheers as steel meets steel, echoing the brutal reality that medieval knights' lives were often gambled on in moments like this. No room for error, no safety net. The clang of swords continues, each strike sharper and more desperate than the last. You notice the way Jean's breath quickens, the sweat tracing lines beneath his helmet, mixing with the grime of the day. Every movement is a razor-thin margin between triumph and catastrophe. Jacques Legris fights fiercely his reputation as a skilled swordsman. No exaggeration, his strikes are calculated, almost mocking in their precision. The duel doesn't just test their physical strength, but their mental stamina. You can feel the weight of years of rivalry and accusation hanging heavy in the air. Making each clash more than just a battle of weapons, it's a war of wills. Jean knows that beyond the fight lies his wife's honor, his own legacy, and the trust of the kingdom's justice system. No pressure, right? Here's a quirky tidbit: some medieval duelists would secretly coat their blades with poison, hoping a scratch would be fatal. Thankfully, this duel stayed clean, but it reminds you how brutal and underhanded medieval combat could sometimes be. Not all knights were noble in their methods, and honor was a flexible concept. Historians still argue whether the duel was truly fair, or if social status tipped the scales behind the scenes. Was Jean fighting for justice, or simply trying to claw back power and prestige in a deeply hierarchical society? That question lingers like the dust settling on the battlefield. The crowd is tense, their eyes flicking from sword to sword, whispers turning into murmurs of hope or dread. You can almost hear the collective heartbeat of those watching, all tethered to the outcome of this deadly dance. Victory here isn't just survival. It's a statement of vindication and a rare chance to rewrite one's fate in a time when fate was often cruel and unforgiving. You trudge forward with the duel, feeling every step like a slow-motion replay of all the tension so far. Jean's sword glints in the dimming light, reflecting the eyes watching with bated breath. His muscles ache, but his mind is sharper than ever, laser-focused on the next move. Every parry, every strike is a conversation in steel, each man trying to outwit, outlast, and outfight the other. Here's a slice of reality: knights weren't just fighters, they were also showmen. The duel was as much a spectacle as it was a trial. Crowds gathered like it was a medieval version of pay-per-view, cheering, gasping, and sometimes praying for their favorite to win. The stakes were colossal. Losing meant death, shame, or worse, disgrace. One quirky detail often overlooked is the role of the seconds, those knights who accompanied the duelists, making sure the fight followed the strict rules of chivalry. Think of them as medieval referees, but with swords ready if things got out of hand. Their job was vital but perilous. They balanced on a knife's edge between peacekeepers and combatants. Historians still argue whether the duel truly represented justice or was a spectacle for the elite, masking the harsh realities of power struggles beneath. Was this fight an honest quest for truth, or a carefully staged drama to entertain the nobility? The line is often blurry in medieval history. As sweat drips down your brow, the duel crescendos toward a climax. Jean's movements grow more desperate, yet precise. You can almost hear the slow, deliberate breaths, the scrape of boots on dirt, and the metallic ring echoing like a grim lullaby. This moment could change everything, not just for Jean, but for the entire idea of justice in medieval France. The duel drags on each second, stretching longer than the last, as if time itself is holding its breath. You can feel the weight of every glance from the watching nobles, the murmurs rippling through the crowd like a restless wind. John's body screams from exhaustion, but his mind clings stubbornly to focus. Every block, every strike is calculated, born from years of training and raw survival instinct. Here's a fascinating fact: that the duel wasn't just about swords and skill. Both men fought knowing that this was their last chance to prove honor and innocence. If John lost, the accusations against him would stand forever, sealing his fate and shaming his family. Victory meant redemption, but only if he survived the deadly dance. A quirky detail for you: the exact weapons used were sometimes chosen by the seconds, and these choices could be strategic. Was the sword heavier or lighter? Did it have a particular design that favored one fighting style over another? These little nuances could tip the scales in a duel where the difference between life and death was razor thin. Historians still argue whether these judicial duels genuinely delivered justice, or if they were skewed by politics, social standing, or the whims of the crowd. Some say the duel was a cruel game, while others see it as a last bastion of fairness in a time without modern courts. As Jean presses on, the sun dips lower, casting long shadows that stretch like ghostly fingers across the battlefield. Your heart pounds in rhythm with the clash of steel, the tension so thick you could slice it with a sword. Every moment draws you deeper into this perilous story, one where honor, pain, and fate collide in a brutal test of humanity. The final moments arrive with a mixture of desperation and resolve, swirling through the air like a storm. Jean de Carouge, battered but unbroken, summons every ounce of strength left in his body and mind. His opponent, equally fierce and driven, matches each move with brutal precision. You feel the sweat trickle down your back, the metallic taste of adrenaline mixing with the earthy scent of the ground beneath your feet. Here's a well-known historical fact: the duel ended with Jean delivering a fatal blow, proving his innocence and restoring his honor. This victory didn't just save his life. It echoed through the courts and villages, a reminder of the deadly seriousness with which medieval justice was wielded. But it came at a steep price. Both men suffered deeply, and the scars of that day lingered long after. A quirky tidbit to lighten the mood: some accounts say that after the duel, spectators collected bits of armor and weaponry as souvenirs, a medieval version of autographs or concert memorabilia, if you will. Imagine that, holding a dented sword fragment and bragging about witnessing one of history's most infamous fights. Historians still debate how much of the story was shaped by political agendas, personal vendettas, or even the desires of those chronicling the event. Was justice truly served, or was it a spectacle wrapped in the guise of law, as the sun finally sets, casting a warm glow over the weary crowd? You breathe a slow sigh, the tension finally releasing like the last notes of a haunting melody. The story of Jean de Carouge isn't just about swords or honor. It's a glimpse into a world where life was fragile, and courage was the only currency that mattered. Now, as you settle in, let the echoes of steel and whispered promises fade gently into the night. Remember, history isn't just about dates or battles. It's about the people who lived, loved, and fought through it all. Hey guys, tonight, we're slipping into chainmail, clutching a sword that's heavier than your regrets, and riding into the past, straight into the iron-bound world of medieval knighthood. Picture this. You're 10 years old, already sore from training, your hands blistered from gripping a wooden practice sword, and the only escape is dreaming of glory that may never come. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least the armor looks cool until you find out it smells like wet dog and desperation. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born into a world where freedom is a word whispered by peasants and laughed at by lords. Your father is a minor knight, barely clinging to his scraps of land, and your fate is sealed the moment you open your eyes. There's no debate, no dream of becoming an artist or a baker. You will fight. You will kneel. You will serve. From age 7, you're packed off to another noble household as a page. That sounds cute, right? Like a medieval boarding school. Not quite. Your job is to clean armor, tend horses, polish boots, and learn how to bow so deeply you practically kiss the floor. If you make a mistake, there are no second chances, only Cuff's punishment and that burning shame of failure. By 14, you're a squire. It sounds impressive until you realize it's unpaid labor with bruises. You sleep on hay, maybe in a corner of the stables. You spend your days dragging weapons, tending wounds, memorizing war prayers, and trying not to die of infection from your own training injuries. And if you're lucky, really lucky, you'll be knighted someday. Historians still argue whether the ceremony was more honor or trap. One mainstream belief is that knighthood was a reward for valor, a symbol of elite chivalry. But in practice, it often worked more like a contract you couldn't read. You weren't just given a sword and a title, you were sold into a system. You swore loyalty not to an idea, not even to a king, but to a lord. One man, one house. And from then on, your life wasn't yours. You're expected to be brave, yes, but also obedient to the point of idiocy. Your lord wants to go to war over a family insult. You ride. He sides with a rival king. You follow. You could spend years fighting in battles you don't believe in, for causes you never chose in lands you'll never understand. And each time you tell yourself it's for honor, even when your comrades are bleeding out beside you in mud and filth. Let's not even talk about the armor. It takes 2 men to help you into it, and once you're inside, forget comfort. You sweat buckets. You can't sit properly. You certainly can't run. If you fall off your horse, and believe me, you will, you might not get up. Some suits of armor even required a tiny trap door in the back so you could relieve yourself during battle. Dignity, yeah, that left the building when you became a walking tin can. There's a fringe historical anecdote, no one's entirely sure if it's true, but it claims one poor knight was once mistaken for a statue and left behind after a siege. He lived barely trapped in his own suit for days, surrounded by flies and rats. If it didn't happen, it probably could have. And the worst part, everyone admires you. To the peasants, you're some gilded god on horseback. They don't see the boils under your helmet or the nightmares that wake you in a cold sweat. They don't hear you mutter apologies in your sleep for things you did in the name of loyalty. They just bow and beg and hope you don't ride past their fields with a lord who wants to borrow some grain. You start wondering if this is really honor or just glorified servitude wrapped in a nice surcoat. You remember when your mother whispered stories about saints and angels, how knights were supposed to protect the weak. And now you sit at night by a campfire, too tired to even pray, sharpening a sword that's already claimed too much. There's no escape. Not unless you want to become a mercenary or a deserter. But desertion is death, if not by sword, then by slow anonymous starvation. No one trusts a knight without a lord. You're like a stray dog in a world of wolves. Even your armor becomes a liability. It's worth more than your life, and someone will kill you just to strip it off. So you keep riding, keep obeying, keep serving. Because the truth is, you were never trained to do anything else. So you keep riding, day after day, And with each passing mile, the illusion of chivalry chips away, like dried blood on your gauntlets. You arrive at a castle, your lord's newest ally or enemy, or maybe someone in between, depending on yesterday's gossip. As a knight, you don't ask questions. You're told where to stand, who to guard, and when to speak. Which is rarely. Unless, of course, it's to swear your oath again. For the 50th time this year. The banquet hall is warm, glowing with torchlight. Boars roast on spits. Goblets clink. A minstrel sings a song about honor and gallantry, and somewhere along the way he rhymes valor with mallet, which makes no sense. But no one notices because the guests are drunk, and you're standing guard, not seated at the table. That's another part they don't tell you. Knights may be nobles, but you're still just an armed servant in someone else's story. Your stomach growls. You haven't eaten since morning. A page tosses you a bone with a sliver of meat on it. You pretend it's enough. You lean on your sword, trying not to fall asleep on your feet. One wrong move, and you'll be reprimanded, maybe demoted. Historians still argue whether knights were truly autonomous warriors or just glorified security guards for the aristocracy. Tonight, you're leaning toward security guard. But let's go back a little. Because becoming a knight wasn't just about swinging swords, it was about money. Lots of it. Armor was absurdly expensive. A full suit could cost the equivalent of a small house. Horses, even more. A well-trained war horse called a destrier could be more valuable than some castles. And you didn't just need one horse, you needed 3 or 4 plus squires to tend them and servants to clean your gear. If your family wasn't wealthy, you had to borrow everything, which meant debts, crushing debts. You owe your armor to one lord, your horse to another, your sword to a merchant who expects favors, and your boots. Well, you're pretty sure those were stolen from a dead man in Flanders. Don't ask. This brings us to tournaments. This brings us to, on paper, their training exercises. In reality, they're blood sport mixed with gambling and a pinch of fashion show. You enter hoping to win fame and fortune. You leave with a broken rib and a horse that isn't yours anymore because some lucky jerk unseated you and took it as a prize. That was allowed. It's called ransom. Fun, right? One lesser-known tidbit. Some knights started wearing fake armor, cheap decorative metal painted to look like the real thing just to impress in parades. It looked great. Until you had to fight in it. Let's just say those guys didn't last long. You also need a coat of arms, a symbol that tells the world who you are. Sounds majestic, but there's a catch. If your family never registered one, you might not be recognized as a true knight. Imagine going through all that training, all those battles, and then being told you're basically a cosplay extra at a feudal LARP event. And remember, this isn't a golden age of hygiene. Your armor traps sweat like a sauna made of regret. Lice thrive in your tunic. Your sword calluses get infected. You've got fleas, athlete's foot, and some strange boil on your neck that's starting to smell funny. There's no doctor, just the castle barber, who thinks bleeding you with leeches will solve everything. Spoiler, it doesn't. You've now served in 4 campaigns. You've crossed rivers, marched through snow, and nearly drowned in a moat that wasn't even enemy territory. It was just poorly marked. You once fought bandits for 3 straight days to protect a wine shipment. The wine was for your lord's wedding. You weren't invited. And still, every time you close your eyes, you see faces. Friends who fell in skirmishes no one remembers. Civilians caught in the chaos. That one peasant woman whose village burned, who looked at you like you were the monster. Maybe you were. Historians still debate whether knights were heroes or thugs in chainmail. The truth may be both. Maybe it depended on the day and the coin. Because coin controlled everything. Without it, you couldn't maintain your equipment, pay your squire's bribe, the officials who handled land grants. Yes, bribe. Don't look shocked. This is feudalism with a side of corruption. You remember the first time you were offered land. A tiny plot near a muddy river. It came with 3 starving tenants and an angry neighbor who claimed half the field was his. You accepted anyway. Because for the first time something was yours, and you thought maybe this is what knighthood was meant to be. Then came the taxes, the fines, the sudden summons from your lord to appear with 10 men-at-arms you can't afford. So you hire farmers, give them pointy sticks, and pray they don't trip over their own boots in battle. At night, you sit by the hearth, oiling your armor with stiff fingers. You still dream of glory, of songs sung about your deeds. But deep down, you know the truth. Most of the glory goes to the bards. The rest just rusts away. You don't sleep well that night. The road ahead has grown darker, and not just because the winter sun is stingy with its warmth. Every time you glance at Marguerite, your wife so quiet lately, you wonder what's left unsaid between you. But there's no time for softness now. You've returned to court armor, polished title intact, and with a grievance sharper than your sword. It's 1386. You're demanding the king himself to grant you a trial by combat. Yes, you're invoking jus gladi, the right of the sword. That ancient law that says if a crime can't be settled by courts, God will decide the victor in single combat. And you're not dueling for honor, not really. You're fighting because your wife says she was attacked while you were away. And she named your rival Jacques Legris. Now, here's where things get spicy. Legris isn't just anyone. He's your former friend, once a guest at your table. Worse, he's the favorite of Count Pierre, the very noble you've butted heads with for years. You suspect politics oozes through this whole affair like mold in a dungeon wall. The king listens. His advisors nod. Your enemy denies everything. And historians still argue whether Legris was genuinely innocent or a master manipulator with charm as slick as his hair. For Marguerite, this isn't a game. If you lose, she'll be burned alive for perjury. That's not poetic exaggeration. The law is literal, and flames don't care about nuance. Still you press forward. What choice do you have if the court won't condemn your enemy? Then the gods or steel will. It's been over a year since the alleged assault, and evidence, as you might guess, doesn't hold up great in medieval France. You don't have fingerprints or DNA. Just a shaken woman's word and your own desperate need for justice. And just for fun, here's your quirky fact: trial by combat was still considered a legitimate legal tool in France until the 16th century. That's right, people were solving felonies with swords for a very long time. So now you begin preparing. You practice daily with your squire's muscle memory layered over bruises. Meanwhile, rumors ripple through Paris. Some say you're brave. Others say you're reckless. A few whisper Marguerite might be lying, caught in some complicated affair. But what eats at you is simpler: what if the truth doesn't matter at all? Your armor feels heavier than usual, not just in weight, but in expectation. You're no longer a knight fighting for land or king. Now you're a man fighting for the truth, or at least what you believe is true. You glance at Marguerite again. She's been sequestered in a quiet tower surrounded by nuns and legal overseers, her every word scrutinized, her virtue dissected like a frog on a table. She's passed every interrogation, never wavered, but still whispers follow her like smoke. The court loves scandal almost as much as it loves pageantry. The king grants the duel. The Parliament of Paris formally declares it a judicial duel, a rare move, even for that era. This will be the last state-sanctioned one of its kind in France. You, Jean de Carouge, will represent your family's honor, your wife's truth, and your own pride. And Jacques Legris, he'll represent something far older, the brutal, smug confidence of men who've never really been told no. But first, the months leading to the duel stretch on like cold molasses. The build-up is ceremonial, almost theatrical. Both of you are kept under watch. Legris remains at a monastery guarded and smug. He has the backing of Count Pierre, a powerful figure who's made it no secret he thinks you're unstable. Here's the mainstream fact for today. Medieval duels were not spontaneous bar fights. They were regulated events with judges, ground rules, even referees. You can't stab a guy in the foot before the horn blows. Meanwhile, weapons are chosen. You settle on a long sword, a dagger, and a war axe. The idea is to allow enough brutality to let God speak clearly. No pressure right quirky tidbit for your insomnia. In some duels, combatants fought naked or in shirts to prevent armor from interfering with divine judgment. Thankfully, this isn't one of those. Historians still argue whether the duel was granted because the king genuinely sought truth or because it was a way to entertain the nobles, distract from war costs, and give Paris something bloody to talk about over bread and beer. As the date approaches, your nerves fray. You have flashbacks of war of blood freezing on steel, of cries echoing through foggy woods. But this duel is more terrifying. Because it's personal. Because if you die, Marguerite dies too. You wake up on the morning of the duel with your heart lodged somewhere between your throat and your stomach. The cold Paris air sneaks through the shutters of your chamber, biting at your skin like a warning. It's December 29th, 1386. Today your fate and hers get settled in the dirt of a public arena. You dress slowly. First the padded gambeson, then the chainmail, then the polished plate armor, every buckle and strap fastened by careful nervous squires. Each clang of metal echoes louder than it should. You almost forget how much it all weighs almost. But your body remembers. Your joints creak, your knuckles ache. You're 36. Not old, but not young. And duels you see are young men's games. Quick, brutal, full of wild chances. You take one last look in the mirror, not to admire, but to study. To memorize. In case this is the last time you see your face whole. Outside, the crowds are already gathering. Parisians wrapped in cloaks and gossip. Nobles in velvet clinking goblets. The king is here seated high above the tilting ground, flanked by his glittering court. They're expecting a show. You try not to feel like a dancing bear in a pit. Now here's your historical fact for today. Duels weren't just fought for justice. They were spectacles. The arena was a wooden scaffold built just for this event, like an open-air theater designed for violence. Up to 10,000 people came to watch. Children, beggars, merchants, priests, all hoping for a glimpse of divine justice, or just a splash of blood. Legris is already there when you arrive. Mounted, calm. His armor catches the winter sun like a mirror. You exchange no words, just stares. That's all that's left now. You don't see a man anymore. You see the obstacle between you and absolution. You dismount, pray, step into the arena. Here's a quirky tidbit before combat. It was customary for each fighter to declare their cause aloud before the king and crowd. So you do. Voice, steady, heart hammering. Marguerite sits nearby wrapped in white, a symbolic color, innocence, or a shroud. Historians still argue, as they always do, whether Legris believed he'd actually win or if he assumed you'd never be granted the duel in the first place. After all, he was protected, respected, rich. You were a warhorse past his prime, a father, a wounded veteran clinging to pride. The signal is given, trumpets blare, and the battle begins. The ground is packed dirt frozen and uneven. Perfect footing for a stumble. You charge first. Legree meets you with a downward arc of steel, his sword glancing off your shoulder. The crowd roars, half in fear, half in thrill. Somewhere, someone is already placing bets. Your heart pounds in your ears. Every strike is a question. Every block is a prayer. Legree is faster than you remember. But rage makes a surprisingly good energy drink. Steel clashes. Sparks fly. The first few blows are cautious testing. Then things get serious. You go for his leg, he parries and counters with a thrust toward your ribs. The blade nicks your male-bite skin. Pain blooms hot but distant like lightning you only half see. Here's your mainstream fact. Medieval longswords weren't heavy like movie props. They were surprisingly agile, about 2.5 to 3 pounds. Light enough to swing with speed, heavy enough to break bones. You feel every ounce of it now. You swing hard overhand, and Legree stumbles. The crowd gasps. Marguerite grips her cloak tighter. Your vision narrows. The world dissolves into angle's edge's impact. Then he regains footing and slams his shield into your chest. You reel backward, breath knocked clean out of your lungs. You almost vomit. You definitely lose count of your teeth for a moment. Now your quirky fact: medieval knights often peed in their armor during combat. No shame. When you're in a kill or die scenario, bladder control isn't top priority. You don't pee today, but only barely. Legree swings again, an upward slash toward your thigh. You block with your gauntlet. It clangs, rattles your bones. Your hand goes numb. The battle slows, then speeds up, then slows again. Like time's drunk and can't decide which way to stumble. The two of you circle. He lunges. You pivot counter with an axe to his hip. A clean hit, but not deep enough. He grunts, staggers. The crowd is screaming now, not cheering. Screaming. Here's where scholars really get into arguments. Some claim Legree begged for mercy at this point. Others swear he denied the charges until his final breath. Truth lost in the mud and roar of a winter arena. Because in the end you tackle him, drive him down, rip off his helmet, and ram your dagger into his exposed throat. He twitches once, twice, then nothing. And in that instant, you don't feel victorious, you feel empty. Because that wasn't justice, it was survival. You stand there, chest-heaving armor battered, the cold seeping in through every crack. Around you, the crowd's shouts begin to fade into an uneasy silence. The king leans forward, his eyes narrowing, ready to pronounce judgment on the bloody spectacle you just made of yourself. This duel, they said, would decide everything, Your Honor, Marguerite's reputation, your very life. But as you catch your breath, you realize something unsettling. Winning isn't the end of your troubles. It's just another beginning. Here's a mainstream historical fact to chew on. Trial by combat was considered divine judgment, God's way of sorting truth from lies. The loser was seen as guilty, the winner innocent. But historians still argue whether this was true justice or just a medieval popularity contest dressed up in armor and swords. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. The armor you've been clanking around in weighs around 50 to 60 pounds. You've been fighting, running, and wrestling in what's basically wearable steel. If you weren't a knight, you'd probably just call it a medieval weightlifting competition. As the king stands to announce your victory, you glance at Marguerite. Her face is pale eyes, glassy, not just from relief, but from the gravity of what's happened. The duel may have settled the accusation against you, but it did so at a cost that no one mentions in the stories. In fact, this is where scholarly debate gets spicy. Some argue that these trials reinforced the power of the nobility, turning violent spectacle into social control. Others believe they were a genuine, if brutal, attempt to uphold justice in a chaotic world. You realize with a heavy heart that your victory might mean your life is spared, but Marguerite's life, her reputation, her safety, is forever changed. The duel ends, but the story is far from over. You find yourself back in the cold stone chambers of the castle, the echoes of the duel still ringing in your ears. The weight of your armor now feels like a shackle, not just from the metal, but from the expectations pressed upon you by your title and victory. It's not just about fighting anymore. It's about navigating the delicate webs of medieval politics and honor. A well-known historical fact, knights were not only warriors, but also vassals bound by feudal oaths to serve their lord with loyalty and military support. Your role is as much about politics as it is about swordplay. Yet historians still argue whether this system truly protected the peasants or just reinforced the power of the elite. On a lighter note, did you know some knights were terrified of fleas? Amid all that shining armor and grand battles, these tiny pests were a nightmare, spreading disease and discomfort under the heavy chainmail. Makes you wonder if medieval hygiene got more attention than their combat skills sometimes. As you sit by the fire, nursing bruises and trying to catch your breath, you think about Marguerite's fate. Society now watches her every move, whispers following her like shadows. Your duel may have saved your honor, but for her life is a constant battle. A reminder that in this medieval world, victory for one often means defeat for another. Scholars continue to debate whether the duel truly served justice, or if it was simply a brutal spectacle that left deeper wounds in society. For you, the scars are both physical and invisible. Your thoughts drift to the future. How do you rebuild after the sword falls silent? How do you live with the knowledge that honor, blood, and politics are tangled so tightly, sometimes impossible to separate? The knight's life is far more complex and far more exhausting than any tale told in the great halls. The days after the duel blur into one another each dawn, dragging you into new challenges beyond the battlefield. Your body aches in ways the duel never prepared you for. But it's the invisible burdens, the judgment, the suspicion, the political games that weigh heaviest. You're reminded daily that being a knight is not just about skill with a sword, but about surviving a labyrinth of shifting loyalties. Historically, knights like you were expected to uphold chivalry, an ideal code of conduct, emphasizing honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak. But historians still argue whether these chivalric ideals were genuinely practiced, or mostly a romanticized fiction penned by poets and chroniclers to gloss over the brutality of medieval warfare. Meanwhile, here's a quirky tidbit: some knights would carry small, love tokens, embroidered handkerchiefs, or rings from noblewomen, believed to bring good luck in battle. Superstition mixed with romance was part of your everyday life, even if it didn't help with the heavy armor or the endless political intrigue. You trudge through the daily grind of courtly life, where every word and gesture might be weaponized by rivals. The duel's aftermath is a double-edged sword. It has secured your honor, but also painted a target on your back. The victory that should have brought relief instead chains you to a new kind of warfare, one fought in whispers and veiled threats. You wonder how many nights before you felt this way, caught between legend and reality, valor and vulnerability. Scholars debate whether knights were heroes or pawns, and as you walk these ancient halls, you begin to see how blurry that line truly is. The duel is over, but your fight for survival and for meaning has only just begun. The weight of your armor feels lighter today, but the burden on your shoulders feels heavier than ever. News from the realm arrives, reminding you that your duel was just a tiny ripple in the vast ocean of medieval conflict. Lords feud endlessly, peasants grumble beneath your feet, and the crown watches with careful eyes. Here's a solid historical fact. Medieval knights were as much political actors as warriors. They owed fealty to their lords, paid with lands and titles, but were also expected to raise armies, attend courts, and act as diplomats. The joust and the battlefield were just parts of a larger complex game. One quirky fringe fact: some knights practiced what might be called knightly self-promotion, commissioning elaborate tombs or chroniclers to write glowing accounts of their deeds. It was an early form of reputation management, long before social media influencers made it a thing. Historians still argue whether these acts were genuine expressions of pride or desperate attempts to shape legacy in a brutal world where death could come at any moment. You sit by the fire, feeling the heat on your scarred face, thinking about how your identity is tied up in this blend of violence, honor, and politics. Being a knight means navigating this tangled web constantly. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and you could lose everything. Your victories on the battlefield might make headlines, but it's your survival in the murky courts and shifting alliances that defines your fate. The duel might have settled one dispute, but countless others simmer just beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark. You realize that the sword is not always the sharpest weapon in your arsenal, and sometimes the fiercest battles are fought far from the clang of steel. You wake up to the blaring call of the herald's trumpet, not the most pleasant way to start your day, but typical in a world where war and ceremony often blend. Today you are summoned to attend a court gathering where matters of land law and loyalty are on the agenda. It's another layer of your knightly duties that often gets overlooked: the endless politics. Here's a historical fact for you. Medieval knights were expected to attend their lord's court, regularly participating in discussions and judgments. These gatherings were a mix of governance and theater, where your presence signaled power and allegiance. The armor you wear for battle becomes a symbol here, a walking reminder of your martial prowess and status. Now for something a bit quirky, some courts had jesters and troubadours whose performances masked sharp political commentary. These entertainers were like the social media trolls of their time, weaving truths and insults into songs and stories. Historians still debate how much influence these performances had on the decisions made by knights and lords. You find yourself navigating this delicate dance, balancing force and diplomacy, sword and speech. Sometimes you wish your sword could do the talking. At least it's clearer than the endless riddles of court politics. But that's the paradox of being a knight. You're a warrior first, yet a politician almost as much. Your reputation here can be as deadly as any weapon, shaping alliances or rivalries that might one day lead to war or peace. You realize the duel wasn't just a battle of strength, but also a stage in the ongoing drama of power and survival. As you listen to heated debates and watch allies shift like sand, you understand that the true battle for a knight is not always fought with steel, but with wit and patience. You trudge out to the training yard, armor creaking, the familiar scent of sweat and leather thick in the air. This is where you sharpen your skills, but also where the brutal truth sinks in. Training to be a knight was grueling, relentless, and downright exhausting. You're expected to master horseback riding, sword fighting, jousting, and archery, all while keeping your wits sharp. A mainstream historical fact: knights typically began their training around age 7, starting as pages, then squires, before finally being dubbed knights in their late teens or early 20s. This decades-long apprenticeship was physically demanding and mentally taxing. It was a lifelong commitment before you even saw real battle. Here's a quirky tidbit: some knights practiced warrior yoga of the medieval age, complicated stretching routines and balance exercises to maintain agility under heavy armor. Strange as it sounds, flexibility could mean the difference between life and a quick death. Historians still argue whether this training truly prepared knights for the chaos of actual combat, or merely created a rigid ideal that often shattered on the battlefield. As you swing your sword and feel the sting of bruised muscles, you wonder if the endless drills ever made anyone truly ready for the terror of battle, or if it was all just a grim rehearsal for the inevitable. Your training yard is a theater of pain and perseverance, where the dream of chivalry meets the harsh reality of survival. Even here, amidst the clang of steel and shouts of instructors, you can't escape the weight of your destiny. A knight's life is hard, and it's about to get harder. You stand in the shadow of the castle walls watching peasants go about their daily toil. Your armor gleams, but it feels heavy with a different kind of burden responsibility for those below you. Being a medieval knight meant not just fighting, but ruling often over lands and people who depended on your protection. Yet the reality, it was a thankless job full of conflict tax collection and endless disputes. Historically, knights were part-time landlords managing estates and dispensing local justice. This administrative role could be more draining than wielding a sword. You quickly learn that the peasants' grumbles aren't just noise, they can spark rebellion if ignored. Here's an odd fact. Some knights tried to improve peasant life by building better mills or offering protection from bandits. But many others exploited their power shamelessly. This duality of knightly rule has scholars debating whether knights were benevolent leaders or mere feudal bullies. As you sit in your lordly hall, hearing complaints and settling petty disputes, the romantic idea of knighthood clashes with the often harsh governance reality. You'd expect a hero's welcome, but instead it's more like running a small tense bureaucracy. Your sword won battles, but your rulership requires diplomacy, patience, and sometimes ruthless pragmatism. You start to realize that the title knight doesn't just come with glory. It drags along a web of responsibilities that can suffocate even the bravest. Peasant revolts rival lords, and royal commands weigh heavily on your shoulders. It's not just the battlefield where knights fight, they wage war on politics and power every day. The sunlight filters weakly through the narrow slit of your tower window, and you lean back, feeling the ache of another long day spent balancing the roles of warrior judge and tax collector. Being a knight means being caught in the gears of the medieval machine, a system that rewards loyalty, but often crushes those beneath it. Your allegiance to your liege lord demands unquestioning obedience. But those lords are as ruthless and self-serving as you are. The struggle for power between kings, nobles, and even the church means your life is less about chivalry and more about political survival. At any moment, a wrong alliance or a failed battle could see you stripped of your lands titles or worse. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some knights would participate in tournaments not just for sport, but as a way to build reputation and gain favor, sort of the medieval equivalent of influencer marketing. Winning a joust could lead to wealth marriages or even royal appointments. But failure, public humiliation, injury, or death. Historians still argue whether these tournaments were more about actual skill or theatrical displays crafted to impress nobles and distract from the brutal realities of war and politics. For you, it's another arena where survival depends on more than just swordsmanship. The knightly code of honor sounds noble, but in practice, it's full of contradictions. You must fight bravely, yet avoid reckless risks that could end your life prematurely. You must protect the weak, but also enforce harsh feudal laws that keep peasants in poverty. You must be loyal, yet cunning enough to navigate treacherous political waters. So you trudge unarmored, not just in steel, but in the heavy weight of expectations, ambitions, and the sometimes crushing loneliness of power. The romance of knighthood fades as the cold reality sets in. Being a medieval knight often meant walking a razor's edge between glory and ruin. The seasons turn, and your once bright armor grows duller with each campaign. Nights are spent in cold, drafty castles, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. You fought battles where friends fell beside you, and enemies who showed no mercy. The weight of your sword is nothing compared to the burden of your role. You might imagine knighthood as a life of glory, but for many, it was a slow grind against hardship, pain, and uncertainty. The constant travel, the risk of disease, and the ever-present threat of betrayal mean your survival is never guaranteed. And yet, the idea of chivalry, the ideal of courage, honor, and service keeps you going, even when the reality seems far from noble. Here's a quirky fact: some knights carried relics or charms believed to protect them in battle. Tiny crosses, saintly tokens, or even bits of animal bone. These talismans gave you a sliver of hope amid the chaos, blending faith with the stark violence of your world. Historians still argue whether knighthood was more a social class or a military function, especially as the medieval period evolved. For you, that question might be academic, but it shapes how the story of knights is remembered today, sometimes as heroes, sometimes as hardened warriors shaped by a brutal time. As you settle down one last time, maybe in a quiet village or your ancestral hall, the weight of your life as a knight begins to lift, replaced by stories told around fires and in halls. Tales that will grow in legend, obscuring the struggles and sacrifices beneath, the romance, the glory, the pain, all intertwined in the life of a medieval knight. And now you can finally let your armor rest.